Hey everyone, hope you're having a good day and staying healthy and getting accustomed to this distance learning thing. On your last video, we kind of did an overview of reproduction, and we looked at two types of reproduction. We looked at sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction as both means of producing new organisms that are either identical or similar to the originals. We talked about sexual reproduction, where all the genetic material is coming from two specialized cells that have to fuse together. These specialized cells are called gametes. In most animals, we have males producing sperm and females producing eggs or ova. And we said that it may be two parents, but it's not. It doesn't have to be. There are some types of plants and things that can produce both male and female gametes, and actually what they would call self-pollinate in plants. But regardless, gametes, these specialized reproductive cells, are formed by a special type of cell division that we see only associated with sexual reproduction, and that is called meiosis. Meiosis. And meiosis is also known as meiotic cell division. It results in 4 cells, each having half of the genetic material of the original cell. So in humans, we saw the example of 46 chromosomes in a reproductive cell. Humans have 46 in every cell in our body, and in those reproductive cells, the gametes that result would have only 23 chromosomes resulting. So that's an example of how meiosis would work and produce cells that have half the number of chromosomes. And then we talked about asexual reproduction, where all the genetic material comes from one parent. It involves mitotic cell division, or what we would call mitosis, and it produces 2 cells that are genetically identical. So that's a major difference between what we see with asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual produces 2 cells that are genetically identical. And hopefully you had an opportunity to watch the Amoeba Sisters video that I posted to give an overview of sexual and asexual reproduction. Well, what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at different types of asexual reproduction. So hopefully you have your notebook out, and we're going to be taking a look at different types of asexual reproduction. So now we know that asexual reproduction produces organisms that are genetically identical to the original, and it carries out this special type of division that we call mitosis, or it's accomplished through this special type of division called mitosis. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to take a look at some different types or different methods that organisms use to reproduce through asexual reproduction, or to produce offspring that are genetically identical. So the first one is called binary fission. And binary just means that something is in twos. And fission just means to split. So literally, binary fission is just where you get one cell that divides into 2 exactly equal cells. That is how we define binary fission. So this is a very straightforward and simple method of asexual reproduction. And it's basically, when we talk about that they're exactly equal, we're talking about in size, so they're the same size, and, and it's both size and in genetic, I'm having trouble today, sorry about that. Still not right. There we go. Let me get rid of that. Size and genetic material or genetic makeup. So that's how they're identical. Same size and same genetic makeup. So an example of this would be what we would see with like an amoeba. So we watch the Amoeba Sisters. Well, an amoeba, sometimes it's spelled like this, with an O. But an amoeba is just a simple single-celled organism. It's kind of like a blob. You need a microscope to look at it because it is a single cell. But they reproduce by splitting exactly in half. So the second type of reproduction that we'll take a look at, the second type of reproduction we're going to take a look at is budding. So this is another type, budding. And budding is where we get asexual reproduction, so we have genetically identical organisms or offspring, genetically identical offspring, yeah, there we go, genetically identical offspring, but instead of being exactly equal in size, they are not equal in size. So the resulting cells are not the same. So if we take a look at an example, yeast can reproduce this way. So if we take a look at a yeast cell, I'm just going to draw a little picture of a yeast cell here. This is the nucleus here. So that's the nucleus. That is a U. And what happens when they start to reproduce by budding, what happens is you start to get this little growth that starts coming off the side. The nucleus kind of splits in half, if you will, kind of starts to elongate and stuff like this. So what happens is the nucleus starts to divide as well as the outer part of the cell divides. So this is what we would call the bud. And it just kind of starts to form off of the exterior part of the yeast cell. And then, of course, eventually you get two separate cells. So this would be the new organism right here. So this is the new organism. I'm going to abbreviate it ORG. And it is genetically identical to the original. And that's what you would see with something like yeast. Now, we also can see this with Hydra. So let me show you what Hydra would look like. Hydra is a little multicellular animal that lives in the water. They're usually about 2 or 3 millimeters in height, so they're really small. You can see them without a microscope, but they kind of look like this. So they're kind of like this. And again, they're very small. They have these tentacles that stick up like this. So these guys are little, maybe 2 to 3 millimeters. And what happens is these guys reproduce by budding too. And what they can do is they can start having this little piece that starts to grow off. So they have this little bud, this little part of their body that starts to grow another little organism. So right here we see the bud. That is the resulting organism. So when it's all done, you have this. So there's our, sorry about that. There's our main bud, our main Hydra. So here it is here like this. And then you got the little guy that's over here like this with all these little tentacles. And they are genetically identical. And that is what we call budding. We also can have what's called vegetative propagation. Vegetative propagation, vegetative propagation. Now, vegetative has to do with plants, and propagation means to move something along. Oh boy, I'm not doing well today with my spelling, I see. At least I'm catching it. Normally, if we were in class, you'd be telling me, I don't think that's spelled right. Well, I have to try to proofread myself here. There we go. Vegetative propagation. So when we talk about this happens in plants only. We don't have this happening in any other animals. And this is where a new identical plant, again, it's asexual reproduction, so it's an identical plant. So a new identical plant from part of another plant. From part of another plant. So you can get this in the roots. This can happen. You can get it in the stems. And you can get this in the leaves. Examples. I'm going to just pull this up a little bit. examples would be what we would see with what we call a cutting. So if you take certain types of ivy and you cut the stem of a branch and you plant it, or you get it, put it into some liquid with a little bit of nutrients in there, it can actually start to root from the stem. It's called a cutting, and you get new plants from the stem. Then we could also have what's called a tuber. This is what we see with a potato. So just an example of this would be like a potato eye, where they actually start to grow a little plant coming out of that part of the potato. If you've ever let potatoes sit for a long time, you might have seen an example of that. And then the last one just happened yesterday, actually. My wife was getting ready to make some meatloaf, and she needed some onions, so I was going to chop up some onions. So I pull out the onions from the refrigerator, and I go through them, and one of them has a little plant growing out of the side of it, growing out of the end of it, actually. So this would be like onion grows from another onion. Onion grows from an onion. So basically, it would look something like this. So you have your onion like this, and then up here you'd have your green sprout that starts to come out of it. And if you've ever seen that, that is what we would see with this type of vegetative propagation that we call, formation of a bulb. And then, of course, the last one that the regents will require to know about is called regeneration. Now, regeneration can be really two things. As a means of reproduction, it's where you get part of an organism that grows into a new organism. So part of an organism grows into a new organism. So an example of this would be like what we see with starfish. So if we have, let's call them their official name, sea stars, because they're not a fish. So I'm going to put it in parentheses. Just if you ever take marine science in the future, you'll learn that they're called sea stars, not starfish. I'm going to put that in quotes. But anyway, so you'd have this little star-shaped looking guy. And if we were to cut him in half, we would have this, and the cut would be there, and then we have this, and then the cut is there. So we've cut him in half. And then what can happen is, over time, this piece will start to grow new tentacles, and then this piece will start to grow new tentacles. And notice they grow back smaller. They're kind of out of proportion after that. But these are genetically identical. So we've taken one organism and actually cut it in half, and two organisms result. There's a story that fishermen were doing this years and years ago, because the starfish, the sea stars, would get stuck in their nets, and they would take them and chop them in half after they pulled them out, throw them back in, and it was just increasing the numbers of sea stars that were actually there. So these are just different types of regeneration. Oh, by the way, yes, one other thing, that regeneration can also be the replacement of lost parts. This is not a method of asexual reproduction, but it is still part of regeneration. Replacement of lost parts. So sometimes, like, for example, a lobster, they can lose a claw, and that claw can be replaced over time. You and I don't have this ability. If you've known anybody that's ever lost a finger, or part of a finger, or anything like that, they don't grow back. But some organisms have the ability to replace lost parts. But just keep in mind, this is not reproduction. That is not a method of reproduction. Reproduction will be making new organisms. So if they're replacing a lost part, it is not. So that's it pretty much for the types of asexual reproduction you have to know for the Regents exam. So what I'd encourage you to do at this point is I'm going to post the topic from your review book. There's going to be a PDF there. And I'd encourage you to go through pages 60 to 62. There's just some information there that helps to reinforce this, as well as a couple of questions that would be helpful. I think there's 10 questions on page 62 that would be really helpful. So do those 10 questions and just review the review book. And we're going to talk about different types or a little bit more detail about sexual reproduction and stuff in our next video. So have a good day, and we'll talk soon.